I want to talk a little bit about a survey that I found a couple days ago. I saw the article on the Federalist, and it really struck me as being interesting because it shows what is going on in the mindset of millennials and Generation Z right now as we face this crisis, not just the crisis of the pandemic itself, but also the economic fallout. I mean, millennials, for example, have a double whammy of the Great Recession and now this crisis and the economic malaise we're in and the recession we now find ourselves in. But also, you've got Generation Z now experiencing their own turmoil. The poll was conducted on behalf of Young America's Foundation and the Federalist, and Young America's Foundation spokesman Spencer Brown joins us to talk about it here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Spencer, welcome to the show, sir. It's good to have you.
Hey, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So what inspired you guys to move forward with this kind of poll? I mean, what was it particularly about the dynamics we're seeing unfold right now that made you think we really need to look into how these young Americans are doing right now?
Well, yeah, so Young America's Foundation, we work with high school and college students all the time to bring conservative ideas to their campuses and their schools. And so as part of that work, we really do need to understand and know where they're coming from and sort of what they're worried about, what they prioritize in their lives, so that way we're better able to serve them and to help them reach their peers. And so with a poll like this looking at Gen Z, coronavirus and everything else that's brought kind of presented a natural opportunity to get sort of our finger on that pulse and see, how are these young people, sort of the youngest part of the rising generation, how are they being affected by this? How are they viewing the response? Who do they blame for this? And then also just sort of check in and see, what are their priorities for the future? Are those things that are changing compared to the millennials that you mentioned? Because we did see a huge impact in how millennials, prioritize things like getting married and having kids or buying a house due to the Great Recession. And so we were interested to see, how could this maybe impact now Generation Z as well?
Yeah, it's a very detailed survey covering areas where I think people haven't been paying close attention to. And I absolutely agree with you. Like, you have to understand the demographic and the circumstances of the people you're trying to appeal to persuade, to interact with in order to be successful. I've been doing a lot of work myself focusing on the millennial generation, Generation Z. When you're working with college students and high school students as the up-and-coming generation now, it's crucial. What are some of the overall top-line conclusions you guys drew? And I do have some screen grabs of some of the data from the Federalist story that I saw this about this that we'll put up here on the screen in a moment. But overall, sort of top-line conclusions.
Well, I think one of the things that wasn't super surprising but was good to see nonetheless is that a large majority of Generation Z students are following this situation very closely. And we see sort of what was interesting was where the fear comes in for them. We found that more students are concerned that a friend or a family member will get coronavirus than they themselves are. And while we did find, the disruptions have been significant for everyone, but even Gen Z, these young people, they have had their jobs have been lost. They've had hours cut if they still have a job. Their universities and colleges and high schools have shut down. But we found that more than 3/4 of Gen Z students polled actually support the disruptions to the economy and day-to-day life because it keeps people safe, even if it affects their own generation negatively. So I think that was heartening to see. That I know a lot of people kind of malign young people in general. I know millennials got the bad end of that deal for a long time as being selfish and self-absorbed and not caring about anyone else. But what the poll showed is that young people are actually concerned that people in their life may get coronavirus and, suffer from that. But they're still okay with paying a price right now in order to help get us all through this.
That's so interesting. Let's put up, this is YAF 3. Again, from the Federalist story about this, 79%, going to your point, of Generation Z students believing these disruptions are necessary. What do you think is underneath that? I mean, is it concern for their parents, for their grandparents specifically, or is there something a little bit more? Because there is this notion among a lot of conservatives especially that the government has gone too far in this circumstance. And so if you're going to be trying to persuade Generation Z that you shouldn't, moving forward, have too much government involvement, I think that number is one that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And one of the other we didn't just ask about coronavirus, we asked sort of general ideological questions as well in this poll. What we found is that almost a half of all Gen Z students view the federal government as a threat to their personal freedoms and liberties. And so there is still sort of that recognition there that the government while they're okay going along with what they're saying now, they do still see it as a threat. And we also saw that they prefer to have a smaller government with lower taxes and fewer services than a larger government with higher taxes. But then one of the other things that we often see in polls like this, that we've seen in a number of our own polling results, is that while they say they want lower taxes and less government, when you ask them just about government programs, they actually think we need more government programs. And so that's where we see, one of those really clear opportunities, like you were just mentioning, where this is a place to say, okay, if you want government programs, who's going to pay for that? That's the taxpayers. And so it's a great opportunity to illustrate the fact that the government, you say it's a threat, you still want the government to do things, but you also don't want to pay more in taxes. There's clearly an opportunity there to say, here's where that doesn't add up, and here's how we get the result we actually want.
I think the same thing goes for millennials, who have this dichotomy of, we want the government to be more involved because we think that people have been struggling so much due to economic failures and strife and so forth. But at the same time, personal liberty is something that is very much a value of Generation Y. And it is good to see that Generation Z is picking that up, perhaps even more so.
Yeah, I mean, that whole idea of sort of individual liberty and the freedom to do what you want is something that really does fit in well with sort of the personality that both millennials and Gen Z have taken on, where, they're in this time where, thanks to online and social media, you can have people basically creating businesses on their own, doing all these startups, making a name for themselves and becoming famous just because of TikTok, or for millennials, I guess it was Vine back then. And you see that they really do want the freedom to do whatever makes them, find fulfillment or whatever that may be. And so that sort of thing is why, talking about entrepreneurship and the importance of making the life that you want by yourself is so important. But obviously, when we look at some of these numbers, we see there's a disconnect where they still think the government should be the one helping people rather than, people just in general in the free market system helping each other out of necessity in order to stay open as a business.
Now, I do want to put up two more images that will kind of help to encapsulate this. Number 5 shows the information you gave about the smaller government, rather having a smaller government with fewer government programs and lower taxes. And then also number 6, which was interesting, about 46% of Gen Z high school and post-secondary students believing that the federal government threatens their own personal rights and freedoms. How do you square that circle? I mean, what do you think is the reasoning why, on the one hand, you would see Generation Z want more individual liberty and have that protected, and in many cases believe that the federal government is impinging upon individual liberty, but at the same time looking to the government? Because I think some of that really goes to the core of the millennial question as well, but particularly for Generation Z. I mean, what do you think is that dichotomy? Is it education that's part of it, or are there other factors in play?
Well, I think part of it is just because Gen Z now, is mostly high school students and then some college students, I suppose. A lot of them haven't had that situation yet where they realize sort of the full force of the government and what that means in your daily life whenever it comes time to do taxes, if you start a business and you have to comply with all these regulations. And so if you look at what they've learned and what their experiences are, they haven't had those sort of harsh interactions with what government takes and what it does in order to get by. And then on the flip side, all they're really learning, unfortunately, in most of these classrooms and from these professors and from their other peers, is just sort of a glorification of things like the New Deal and, the bank bailouts and the auto manufacturing bailouts. And so they're being told, again, not the complete story. So all they're getting is like, oh, government programs have saved this country repeatedly through history, if you listen just to the lessons. They themselves haven't had that assumption sort of tested in the real world yet.
And I think that goes, again, it's the same concept with millennials. For example, 2008 financial crisis, I was entering college as a freshman, and I remember through my 3 years, managed to get out a year early, which going to a private school, Regis University in Denver, was very helpful. But I'm remembering all of these students who were being told, or themselves talking about how capitalism had failed, and therefore we needed more government action to step in order to help people. And I think a lot of Gen Z, they were young kids during the Great Recession, and they may have seen their parents struggling, or an older sibling who might be a millennial who was having these ideas of, what am I going to do when I get out of college? Am I going to be able to succeed in life, find a job, prosper? And then they were coming out, and we'll get to higher education costs in a moment, but am I going to be able to get my debt paid back and what have you. And so there's this idea that the government is trying to step in to address a failure of capitalism, and that may be something we're seeing with Gen Z right now too, that sort of reinforces some of the ideas that they have been taught or haven't been taught.
I think that's definitely accurate. The left, almost all the time, whenever there is really any crisis, they always scapegoat something that conservatives love, and usually it's kind of a bedrock principle. Instead, it's actually a failure of government that is to blame, but obviously they can't admit that, because then that would call into question the whole point of having a government supposedly in charge of and running and taking care of everything else. And so we see that anytime there's economic issues, they say this is a problem with the free market, rather than usually there was some kind of government mucking around in there, trying to kind of tinker with things that ends up being negative because you weren't allowing a true free market to flourish and allow prosperity. We see the same thing anytime there's some sort of mass shooting or a violent incident like that. They always blame the Second Amendment rather than government. Unfortunately, in many of those tragic cases, you can easily point to a phase along the way leading up to that where the government failed to do what it's supposed to do, or what it claims to do, right, which is to protect people and enforce the law. And so, it's one of those things that, again, when you're in that bubble of education, it's obviously worse in college, but we see it in high school with our students as well. When you're in that bubble, you're only really getting the one side, which is, again, this glorification of government, and you never hear about all the failures or the problems with it. And that's why, once you get into the real world and you start paying taxes and you see every month or every 2 weeks on your paycheck how much is taken out, you're like, wait a second, what are they doing with that money?
Sure. Well, and I would say that what you just added on is such an important point. I mean, you look at the financial crisis 2008. If you actually look deeply at it, you will find that it was years of failed government policies that led to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And then today, we have government shutdowns that have been enforced by government. Sure, I think a lot of people would have shut down their businesses anyway because of health concerns, but nevertheless, it was the government stepping in and taking these actions, but also failing to prepare as far as getting, in some cases, getting ventilators ready and stocked up right away and so forth. Although I would add that we ended up not really having those shortages that were foretold because the private market did step up. But I do think that there are a lot of fallacies in the understanding of young people because of the educational aspects and so forth, that where we cannot let them continue to think that the financial crisis of '08 and what we're facing today are due to capitalism, because it's not true.
Well, yeah, and they'll always keep trying to scapegoat that. And I mean, the way they talk about things like the Great Depression and the New Deal, they again painted in exactly the same thing, where this is solely the responsibility of free markets, or this idea that we should be free to participate and engage with whom we want in the market. And they never talk about government policy or how government, the government creates the problem, and the government is then needed to fix the problem. But nobody ever actually lays it out like that. And that's right, sort of what's wrong with education today.
Let's do two final things here with you, Spencer Brown, again, spokesman for Young America's Foundation. Let's put up YAF 2. 48% of post-secondary students have changed their post-graduation plans as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Expand on that for us.
Yeah, so that was one of those things we wanted to find out just sort of generally. A lot of people that I was talking to, who are our students on campuses and our activists around the country, were telling me, how this was affecting not just the fact that they, can't walk at a graduation this spring, or they can't have a summer internship. I was interested to know if this was actually changing their plans for once they're done with college or done with high school. And what we found there, almost half of students who are currently in college have now changed what they're planning on doing once they graduate. So that's not just people who, just are graduating right now. That's people who could still be looking, at 2 or 3 years of college before they graduate. But this sort of a thing is already making them think twice about what their plans were and whether they're sustainable. And that's one of those things that I think will tie back in with what we saw with millennials reacting to the Great Recession, where, again, all of a sudden you're doing the calculus of, what if I can't get a job after I graduate? Can I afford to go to school? What program should I be in? What sort of are the industries that will hire me right now? And we did see that have a lasting impact, because then the ultimate sort of result of concern about money led to delaying getting married, having children, buying homes. And then that, again, also rippled through the economy, where you have fewer people in these stable long-term relationships, fewer people owning property and building equity. And I think that sort of thing could happen here too. But the question is, now that this is really a global phenomenon, and the United States, thankfully, though, is, I think, better prepared than most other countries in the world to bounce back from this. I think we can limit sort of the damaging changes. Some of the changes that will come out of this will arguably be good because it's driven all this innovation with online e-commerce and everything else. But seeing that half of college students are changing their plans definitely suggests that this is a bigger thing than just what's happening in this year and this summer.
And final question for you, Spencer Brown. I mean, obviously, there seems to be a lot of similarities between how we can win over millennials and how conservatives can win over Generation Z. When you distill it down for people as far as what we need to do in order to be effective, what's your encapsulating sort of elevator pitch on how to win over young Americans?
Well, one of the biggest things, it's actually an example that our the new president-elect of Young America's Foundation, Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin, often uses, and it's the example between Uber and taxi. If you want to see what conservative and free market solutions can do, ask young people today, when was the last time you took a taxi? You know, unless they live in New York, I'm guessing they've never thought about calling to order a taxi the night before they're going to the airport, and they've never tried to hail a cab walking out of a restaurant after dinner. They all use Uber on their phones or Lyft or whatever it is. And that is just one of those examples that is so easy and so sort of immediate for students to realize, oh yeah, Uber is a way better solution. The government sure didn't create that. The government has done everything actually to shut that down and destroy it.
That's right.
But it's those real world, real life examples for young people that they can think about immediately. And it doesn't require, that deeper philosophical thing that is important eventually. But at that starting point where you start kind of making them question, is the government good? Is the government helpful? What can the government do? It's things like that, those real stories that actually can make a difference and make people think twice.
And what's the YAF website where folks can go to read the study themselves?
Yeah, all of the information from this poll and everything else YAF has going on can be found on our website, which is yafyaf.org. You
have to make it so complicated, Spencer Brown. Great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us. A very important and fascinating study that I think confirms a lot of things I would think might be true. So I appreciate you joining us today, and stay well and be healthy.
Absolutely. You too.
Thank you again. Spencer Brown, spokesman for Young America's Foundation, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah. Awesome.